Okay, great. Well, hi everyone, welcome. This is the Argonaut Project 2020 kickoff for the 3 projects that we have identified that we're going to work on in 2020. So thanks so much for joining. I know there are more people joining. We're up to 30 now, and the list keeps growing. But why don't we get started here? So we are. For the Argonaut Project set of projects every year. This year we chose 3, which are the ones that we're going to stay with, which is the continuation of the best controls, patient lists. So those are 3 that we know we're going to move forward with. We'll be having a discussion with the steering committee about a possibly intentionally left a sort of a spaceholder to wait for the rules, the final ONC and CMS rules to be published. And now that those are published, we will go back to the steering committee and discuss, a possible 4th project. And there are a number of really good candidates there. But the point here is for this project is going to be, for this call, is to really just have a joint kickoff of all 3 working groups together. And Josh here, and he'll describe sort of the general project management approach that we're going to take across the 3 projects, and then start the content for each of the projects. Subject matter experts who will be working on the working groups, in addition to Josh, which is Dan Gottlieb, Brett Markhardt, and Eric Haas as well. So they're also on the call, and very much look forward to working with all of you this year. Josh?
Thanks, Mickey, and thanks everyone for joining. What I want to share with you is a little bit of introduction to the way that we'll be running projects this year. It's going to be pretty consistent with the way that we've done things in the past, but just trying to get down to a routine now that we've been at this for a little while. And then we'll go into the details on each of the 3 projects that we know we're taking on for this year, and we'll introduce the folks who are going to be helping lead those projects as we go. Just a quick note for the webinar platform. If you've got a question, you may not be able to speak because you're muted, but if you click the raise hand button, we'll try to monitor that and unmute you, but you can also just type a question into the chat. And one final note that we're recording this session, and we'll make the recording available openly to the community so that folks who weren't able to join today can still catch up on the plan. And with that, let me jump right in. So thinking through the projects that we're going to be running this year, we want to talk through a couple of sort of rules of the road and building on the way that we've done things in the past. So the goal is, we've always had an open process where folks could come and join our calls and contribute, but we want to just make this explicit. So for these 3 projects that we're kicking off right now, each one of these will have a clear path for open community participation, and we'll be sure that the notes from our various project calls and meetings are available so that folks who can't participate online can still follow quite closely. But one area that's been really important for me has been trying to maintain strong participation. And thinking historically about the way that our projects have gone, we often have a lot of folks who will dial into conference calls sort of to listen and to keep up without being active, technically engaged participants. And to some extent, that's good because it creates shared visibility, but it can also mean that the calls aren't as focused and productive as they could be. So we're going to be trying a couple of experiments. I'm not sure this is going to work, but I wanted to raise this as an issue and also just solicit ideas from the rest of the community about how we might address it. What we're going to try this year to promote passive dial-in is hosting 2 kinds of calls. They'll both technically be open, and anyone can decide which ones they want to join. But we'll have these project-specific working group calls for each of the projects that we run. And here the target audience is really people who are going to be contributing directly to the specifications, folks who are working on software development, reference implementations. The goal is that these will be technically oriented calls. And then for folks who want to be able to keep tabs on the projects and contribute at a high level, we'll be hosting checkpoint calls that will go cross-project so that folks who are engaged in the Argonaut community have one place they can turn to each month to get updates across the board and to be able to share feedback. So this is a broader stakeholder group. So this is sort of a public service announcement. If you find yourself, and we all do this in some context, if you find yourself often joining calls and just sort of listening in, consider not joining the work group calls and consider joining those checkpoint calls instead. We'll do updated, detailed public notes, and you'll get from those project updates hopefully what you need. As I said, this is an experiment. It might be a terrible idea, but we figured we wanted to try something. So that's what we'll try, at least as we get started. And then a few words about the way that we'll be working together with the HL7 community. Of course, Argonaut is a standards accelerator inside of HL7. And we want to make sure that we are both effective and can move quickly, but that we're also following community norms and processes, and it's clear how our work slots back into underlying HL7 workgroup activities. So the model that we'll be working with this year is that we'll have sort of an acceleration phase that happens towards the beginning of the project, where we're able to rapidly learn and experiment and try things out quickly. And in that context, we're managing issues and pull requests more specifically in GitHub, so that most of our discussions can stay very closely tied to the underlying platform where we're editing the specs. But then we'll move each project into a consolidation phase. In other words, we'll move these into the formal HL7 process when the time is right. And this will differ project by project. We can talk about some of the details when we get there, but there will be a formal point at which this work moves into the official HL7 tracking tools and is owned by a work group before it proceeds to ballot. So that last stage is standardization. Once it's owned by a work group, it can proceed into a ballot if it's content that is important to ballot through HL7. So that's a little bit on rules of the road. Before we do questions on this, let me just sort of share one last slide in terms of project management hygiene. So we're trying to provide a clear landing page link. And so this might get redirected over time, but right now it's 2020.argo.run. This will take you to the page on GitHub, but it should be easy to remember. And that page will have links to all of the relevant project meeting notes and so forth. Dial-in information for our phone calls, links to this presentation once the recording is available. So the goal is that should be your landing point. No matter what project you're interested in, you can find it from there. As each project kicks off, we'll be doing onboarding surveys for participants in that project. And each project is going to have an Argonaut announcements stream. I've created these streams already in Zulip. And so the idea here is this is going to be the official place where announcements go out. We're not going to try to manage things in parallel between mailing lists and Confluence and calendar invites and so on. We're going to have an announcement stream per project in Zulip, and that should be the official place to go. So we'll send links, for example, to our onboarding survey there, and we'll try to understand the level of commitment that each member will bring to the projects, the kinds of things that people are interested in working on. We'll solicit information about use cases and priorities, and we'll also, in some cases, ask for participants to recommend who else should we be recruiting to participate in this process, because historically we've had some underrepresented groups. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to that early on. And then you'll also find links to the meeting notes once we start these projects, attendance sheets, and some of these working group calls we may decide to record. We'll look for some feedback and see if there are some really nice attributes of being able to share those recordings even for folks who couldn't join. So that's a little bit on project management kind of hygiene. If there's a couple of questions before we move on to the specific projects, we could spend 2 or 3 minutes on questions now. Otherwise, I'll propose that we press on. I see nobody with their hand raised. Apologies if you have it and I'm missing it. So let's move on then to the first project. And this is actually one that I will introduce. So Brett Marquardt and I will be the subject matter experts helping to lead the granular controls project. We've picked a time for recurring calls, which is going to be Wednesdays at 2 p.m. And just to give you a brief on the current state of things, the SMART implementation guide was finalized and published at a 1.0 level. It's published at the HL7 website, and this is something that's required by ONC's Cures Act final rules that came out last week. And ONC goes into great detail about which features of the SMART spec will be required. And the area of interest for us here is particularly around permissions. So what we call scopes in the SMART implementation guide. ONC says that servers implementing the SMART guide will at the very least need to support resource level scopes, which means basically being able to support things like access to all observation resources or access to all condition resources based on a FHIR resource type. Now, the interesting thing here, of course, is that from a patient perspective, from a clinical perspective, that's not always very meaningful. FHIR resource types is a very technical thing. And often patients want to do something like share data that is non-sensitive data or share vital signs without sharing HIV status, all kinds of things that right now are not well described by the SMART on FHIR implementation guide. So this is an opportunity for us in the community to do better, to go one level deeper and meet some of these use cases. and do it in time for this implementation phase, because ONC's final rule basically has a 2-year implementation phase during which these systems have to build support for the APIs and deploy them to customers. And if we define additional scopes and better controls, there's a couple of paths for putting that in production in accordance with the ONC rules. One is it might just simply build on or dovetail with what's already there. Or two, if we manage to publish an updated specification, ONC could even officially point to that through their standards version advancement process. So we'll get into some of those details in a moment, but I wanted to at least mention some of these use cases around sharing data by category, sharing data based on sensitivity, or other kinds of fine-grained access controls. And the truth is, even though we have a lot of community conversations about how this should look and how this should work, we don't have a solid proposal on the table yet. We're not even exactly sure what's going to be in scope for this project. So an important part as we get started is to review some of the work that's been done before and try to decide on a scope that we think is going to be implementable in real life. This is probably the project that's going to require the most careful balancing, in my perspective, between all the things we wish we could have, sort of the wish list of nice features, versus something that we can consistently and in all likelihood get done in this year to make sure that our timing aligns with ONC's requirements. So I've got a link to some early thoughts that Isaac Vetter and Graham Grieve and I drafted together at a working group meeting, but I also want to be really clear. This is something we spent less than an hour on, sitting around a table at a session that got canceled, and we found ourselves in a room and thought, what could we do for 45 minutes? So this is not even like a starting point. It's just I wanted to link to it because it's the only formal documentation that I've written up at all on the subject. So I included a link to that on GitHub. So that said, thinking about the timeline for the project, we're going to give ourselves a few months, basically March, April, May, to think about building up the community here and deciding, and there really is no pun intended here, but deciding what's in and out of scope for this granular controls project. So that will involve likely a lot of outreach, a set of phone calls and Zulip discussions, and depending on what form the HL7 working group meeting takes this May, maybe a virtual birds of a feather session that we could use to drive a broader conversation. We'd like to start putting together a set of computable specifications, really get our ideas down in a way that people can review and start testing in the sort of June, July, August timeframe, with a targeted Connectathon in September. And even if that's just covering a small portion of the scope, we think that would be valuable. And then for the end of the year, October, November, December, we expect there's going to be at least a round of revisions. So if everything goes really beautifully, I would say the sort of stretch goal here would be that early next year, early 2021, we'd have sort of a smart 1.5 IG that is quote unquote ready, which really means ready to enter a balloting process, not a formally published guide at that stage, but something that reflects at least an early internal consensus. So let me pause here again and see if there's questions on granular controls before we move on to the next project. I see Keith Boone has a hand raised. Pardon me, Keith, while I monkey around with the webinar here. I think that you've been unmuted and can talk.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Awesome. So I would strongly recommend building a project scope statement and running it through the HL7 security work group as one of the HL7 security work group chairs. John Murphy is also already recommended on Zulip.
Yes, good. So I definitely appreciate the recommendation. We'll talk through with John, who's also on our call right now, the details about how to make this work. But we've got a project scope statement currently active for SMART. It's co-sponsored by the security work group. So I think we've got sort of the underlying paperwork laid out there. Let me move on. I know we could have more discussion on this, and we must, but just in the interest of keeping this part high level, let me unmute Isaac Vetter, who also has a hand raised.
Hey, Josh. Hey, guys. I just wanted to clarify that the slide you're showing right now, the SMART Implementation Guide 1.5, is it likely that we're looking at possible other enhancements to SMART in addition to granular controls as part of this project, or as part of maybe that ballot?
So I think it's possible. I don't know how to assess the likelihood yet. The one major feature that we've talked about a little on Zulip has been token introspection, because that's something that ONC has named in their final rule, and it's something that a number of Argonaut vendors have some experience with. So I would say that when we when we come back in Argonaut, just thinking about whether we select a fourth project, if we wind up picking out token introspection as that fourth project, then yes, those features might sort of land in this same revision of the SMART implementation guide. And I'm waving my hands a little bit here because there's a few layers of uncertainty stacked up in that assessment, but the short answer is maybe.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And okay, I'm just going through the hand list one more time. I think that we've got everyone with the raised hand addressed. So let me then talk a little bit. Oh, I left out my goals slide. But basically our goals for this project are to make sure that, yes, please.
Yeah, this is Mickey. There was another question that Isaac had. I don't think he asked it when he had his hand raised, which was just to clarify that the 2 to 3 time for this working group is Eastern time, correct?
That is correct. My bad if we, yeah, 2 to 3 p.m.
Oh, it says Eastern. Okay, good.
Eastern time.
Yep.
Yes. Thank you for that clarification.
And also, we'll send a link to the presentation around shortly.
We'll send a link to the presentation, and also if you go to 2020.argo.run, you'll find as well a link to 2 calendaring resources. There's a publicly viewable calendar, which is hosted in Google. That'll show you, calendar invites with dial-in details and so on. So you could copy this or display it onto your own calendar if you follow this iCal link. So this is a computable calendar format that you can use to import into your calendar app of choice. Most calendar apps have the notion of importing versus subscribing. And the better thing to do is to subscribe, because then you'll also see changes if and when they occur. Okay, so in terms of goals on this project for granular scopes, basically it's publishing a list of what we're trying to do and what we're not trying to do, getting an updated specification, and testing with at least 2 servers and 2 clients. Now, the goal here that's probably the riskiest for me in the near term is getting a publicly deployed open source reference implementation that meets the spec. And of course, this will be more or less feasible depending on what the spec says. But I think it's incredibly important that we constrain ourselves to things that we know how to do. So that's going to be part of the assessment that goes into what we can put in scope here. So our immediate next steps are really to work on use cases and make sure that we know who wants to be part of this community for taking this work forward. Now with that, let me pause and do a little bit of WebEx maintenance to make sure that Eric Haas is enabled as a panelist here. Eric, if you're not, I'm going to click the button to make sure that you become one. Okay, I think that you're a panelist for talking about patient lists.
Okay.
And I'll just advance slides for you if that's all right.
That's fine. Can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. So we're going to go through the patient list project here. We have a proposed time of Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern time. And so we'll go through this project here briefly. And it's not quite as well scoped out as the other projects, and I want to give everybody a warning about that. That's one of our goals, is to really kind of help with the participation to nail down our scope and goals here. So just to go over the background here a little bit about the current state. So we have provider-facing apps often need to know a lot of things about patients, like who are the patients I'm seeing today, who am I responsible for, who are the patients in this ward, and then there's some example use cases I put in here. DaVinci HER has a lot about grouping patient groups based on certain attributions for payers, and then also in subscriptions. In the current subscriptions work, we're doing a lot with groups of patients and want to get some more guidance around the patient lists and groups of patients for subscriptions that we use in subscription topic. And so is Gino on the call?
I think Gino is on the call, but isn't currently unmuted.
Okay. And if he wants to chime in on that, he's the expert on that particular topic. If he wants to chime in, now is a great time. There's really not any standard guidance that we can really point to for managing these patient lists in the specification. And so we have a couple issues going on. We have lists versus group resources, and there's a little bit of overlap there and some uncertainty or I could say over lack of clarity of which one is used in which situation. And then there's also an ability to use specific search criteria to actually create these lists as well. So in this project, we're going to try to define well, our goal, our initial proposition here is to define a few key list types that can be reused and used across the community and well defined to ensure that our apps can interact with these lists as needed, and again, maybe just as read only, but to have those kind of artifacts kind of well defined so that we can, can use them. Next slide.
Sorry, I'm getting there. Okay.
Okay, so here we have, like I said, this project is not as well scoped out as the others, and so we're going to be hoping to lean on our community members to help us, get this nailed down more. But again, one of our main goals is to kind of define these few key list types that we can use and reuse across the FHIR space, and establish some clearer guidance between lists and groups, lists of patients versus groups of patients, and kind of nail that down and land on one side or the other for certain uses. And then we want to have this read-only access capability. That's kind of our initial scope. We define the list, and then you can access the list and use that in your application. And then we may consider, some write accesses to help manage the smaller lists. That's kind of on the, a possible extension of our initial scope that we talked about in the previous slide. And then certainly have some sort of reference implementation or proof of concept demo application to prove out the functionality of what we're doing here. So our timeline here is in the first couple of months. This is very similar to the other timelines. We want to kind of flesh out the scope and goals and kind of iron out our overall plan. And then after that, we can start, initially drafting some guidance and hammering out, a set of lists that we, or a set of definitions for a few lists. And if we're really ambitious, we may be able to have like an initial Connectathon track in May, testing at least, proof of concept on a server and client. And then, of course, in June, we have Dev Days. We certainly want to kind of socialize it there and get more community discussion, and then iterating through the summer until we get to our Connectathon in September, where we can test out more test servers and clients. Hopefully, have participants, creating development servers and so forth to help, test out what we worked on at that point. And then, based on that experience, go ahead and iterate more on the IGE, edit, and prototype implementations. And then again, we have to scope this out, but we have to decide where we want to take this beyond that. If we want to bring it to HL7 with sponsorship likely through, I don't know if probably through patient administration and or FHIR, and see if we want to create a formal guide, a valid guide. But again, we got to kind of scope that out and work those details out as we move forward. So next slide. Oh, this is just about resources. Okay, yeah. So this project can be facilitated by myself and Josh. And like I said, meetings starting every other week. We'll have some resources are listed here, and we're going to be sending out after this call. Josh already mentioned we're going to send out a little survey to see what the use cases are to help us get started on trying to scope this out a little better and define our goals a little more securely. So. I know it's been brief, and I certainly want to open up this to any calls. Anybody on the call who wants to ask questions or any thoughts on the patient list project.
So Keith, your hand is up. I can't tell still or again, but let's see if you are here.
I am indeed here. So I think patient administration is the right place to go. The other suggestion is to be very coordinated with efforts that Da Vinci is doing so that we're not both running down different tracks on the same stuff.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. No, I agree. I did point out that Da Vinci HER and trying to create groups of patients under that are under a certain plan or beneficiary is under a certain plan, excuse me, and is really important. So we're looking at Da Vinci to work closely with them to try to identify if that falls into the the use case that we're going to be focusing on.
Perfect. All right, up next is Dan Gottlieb, who's going to be introducing the bulk data IG work.
Great, thanks, Josh. So can everyone see the slides now? I think we just switched over presenters, so I'm hoping this is working for everyone.
Yeah, slides are working. Your audio is a little bit muffled, but it is intelligible, so if there's nothing easy for you to change, this will work fine.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. That's about all I can do on the technical side. So yeah, we're proposing, so this is bulk data IG version 1.2. So I think a lot of folks on the call are probably aware that we did the initial draft of the initial version of the bulk data implementation guide as a 2018 Argonaut, 2018 Argonaut project, and then validated it through HL7. So it's at STU1 stage right now. And I'll talk a little about kind of what's been developed already and what we're thinking about for like some incremental improvements for this year's Argonaut project. The proposed time is Thursday 2 to 3 for Eastern. Let's see. So in terms of the current state, since we'll be sharing the slides, I put in a link to the implementation guide that we did for bulk data, the slide presentation, a video presentation from last year's Dev Days in June. There's also a reference implementation that the SMART group put together, as well as a server test suite that the ONC, SMART, and MITRE put together as a joint project that covers the current version of the spec. And then there's a fairly active chat channel on Zulip. In terms of current implementations, there's one project in production, that's the CMS's ACO beneficiary claims data, where they're sending data to ACOs using the bulk data specification. There's a pilot project for that CMS is doing for data at the point of care. So that's providing data using the bulk data API to provider organizations for clinical care. And that's currently in a stage where some participants are using a sandbox environment, and they're going to move them to production in the near future. Boston Children's Hospital has an internal pilot that they're doing around payer analytics. And then a number of FHIR servers have implemented support, including Microsoft Happy has partial support, IBM's FHIR server has support, and then Google Cloud has planned support. And then I wanted to point out that although they're not up right now, both Epic and Cerner participated in the Argonaut 2018 work and had pilot implementations that were live then, and we're hoping they'll participate and kind of do a revised version for version 1.2 as part of this project. In terms of some of the impetus for the project, the ONC Cures Act rules, which that came out just a couple weeks ago, requires EHRs to support as a certification requirement bulk data export at the patient and group level. It specifies this DST1 version of the spec, but if we do develop some improvements on the spec, there's an ONC standards version advancement process where we could have the rules changed to use version 1.2 of the spec. So any work we do can still apply to the rules, which are going to go into effect 2 years from now. So in terms of the features that we were thinking of for version 1.2, and these are really just proposals based on that Josh and I put together based on discussions that have happened over the FHIR chat.
Thank you.
Weren't you done?
Okay. Can everyone who's not speaking mute?
Yeah, Brett, you should have the ability to mute people. There's a mute all attendees button that you should press if you can.
Done.
Okay, awesome. Sorry, I could pull up that panel too. Trying to multitask. So these are some features that we're proposing based on discussions with folks who are implementing version 1.0 of the spec and comments that have come up on the Zulip chat and its Connect-a-thons. This is not a final list, so we're going to send out, as a part of the survey Josh mentioned, an opportunity for people to select from this list for the things they think are most important, and also to suggest other changes that they want to see in a version 1.2. And keep in mind, we're really focused on like incremental improvements here, not kind of rewriting the spec as a 2.0 with a lot of breaking changes, mostly because people are just starting to implement it. So one of the big, so I'll just talk through these so that when people see them on the survey, they'll understand kind of what this shorthand means. The first is around group membership changes. So if you're using the since parameter to pull only patient resources that have changed, or only resources that have changed since a particular date, if patients move in and out of a group, their resources may be older than the since date, but you still probably want to get their data without having to re-pull all the data for the entire group from the beginning of time. So we want to address that. Another thing around incremental updates is the ability to indicate if resources should be deleted. The example here is for GDPR compliance, but there are lots of reasons why you might want data to be deleted in downstream systems. And of course, this is different from kind of the logical delete of saying that a record was entered in error or something along those lines. We want to clarify how binary content works right now. Some folks are doing base64 encoding it. Some folks are using links. And so we want to put into the spec a really good way, a good documentation around how PDFs and CDA files should be handled. One suggestion that came up kind of late on Zulip, but I think is a good one, is a way to cancel no longer needs export jobs, particularly since these jobs can be fairly resource intensive for the server. And then the last one is we may or may not want to take on. I don't know how big a problem this is in the real world, but right now, if you check your polling status and get an error, it's a little ambiguous as to whether the error is coming from the polling server. In other words, you can't check the status, or whether it means that the job itself failed. And so figuring out how we clarify that in the spec would be really good. So this is kind of the initial slate of things that we're thinking about as in scope for 1.2, but certainly want feedback from everybody in terms of whether these are priorities and if there are other things we should also put into the project. In terms of a proposed timeline, I think a couple things here we're going to start in the next couple weeks. If we can have a test server and a test client for the May Connectathon, that would be really great. We could do some actual testing. That's kind of a stretch goal because of the timeline. Certainly we're going to have discussions. Otherwise, that first testing tranche will happen in September, hopefully with multiple clients and multiple servers. In the interim, we also are going to be at Dev Days in June, and hopefully, there's a bulk data presentation scheduled, and hopefully, and we can also maybe have some community discussion around some of the work that's taking place. And then the stretch goal is to try to ballot this in January of 2021. That's maybe a little bit tight, particularly if you only have one real Connectathon to test it. But since the scope is hopefully fairly narrow, we should be able to do that. If not, ballot it in May. So that's the proposed timeline. I think I don't know if there are any questions. Is there a way to see raised hands?
I can help with triaging raised hands and questions.
Okay, cool.
Or at least I thought I could. There's like this incredible stacking of tiny sub boxes, and
Christopher Shout and Ricky Bloomfield both have their hands up. Josh.
Does anybody have the ability to unmute them? Because my question is 1 millimeter tall.
I'm going, there you go.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Chris from Epic. I think I'm unmuted now. I was curious, I thought that this project was going to be focused on the handling of exceptionally large files and how Bulk API would handle that. I'm not sure if I missed something in the suggestion there. Is one of those supposed to be about handling very large files?
Yeah, so I think the third one down around binary content for attachments and references, what was that piece? Are you thinking of something different when you talk about kind of large files?
Yeah, I'm thinking about like, what if a CDA or PDF is exceptionally large? Do we handle that in some different way?
Okay, yeah, so I think that would probably fall under that, but maybe we can clarify that in the wording that that's, part of that item.
Yeah, I agree. That certainly should be in scope for the project, and that was the bullet that we thought about it under. So we'll make sure that as we talk about use cases, that one is well represented.
Okay.
Sounds good. I'll switch here to Ricky. Oh, you are self-muted. There you go.
All right, excellent. So this is a bit of a tangential question, but you mentioned the Connect-a-thon. We should probably start thinking now, given that many of us are quote unquote sheltering in place and can't travel, how we might handle a Connect-a-thon and for all of these in virtual ways. Because I think that will likely impact all of these projects as they move forward, given that some estimates are that this pandemic might last up to 18 months of doing this off and on until a vaccine is available. So just something for us to consider practically how we might operationalize a Connect-a-thon.
Yeah, 100%. And this is true for all three projects we're talking about here and for the wider HL7 community. I think at this stage, it's very unlikely that there would be an in-person meeting or an in-person Connect-a-thon no matter what. So a lot of the internal thinking right now is shifting towards how do we make the best use of online resources. And what are the things that work better asynchronously and what are the things that work better synchronously? I think we don't have the answers yet, but my general perspective is we should be experimenting with a bunch of different tools and try to see what works.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would also say that having dedicated time and space to do this can often be helpful. So even if we don't have an in-person meeting, having the same time or a couple of days reserved that everyone has on their calendar can be helpful so that we're still all doing it at the same time.
Yeah, so there's the all doing it at the same time, and there's the having a deadline because of that, which are both very
exactly, 100%. Yep.
Anyone else with hands raised? I think.
Oh, there's Isaac.
Just wanted to say, while it might be unlikely that there will actually be a Connect-a-thon, I think that it is incredibly likely that. So let me restart that. It might be unlikely that there will be a face-to-face Connect-a-thon, but it's very likely that there still will be a Connect-a-thon. And I think that's to Ricky and Josh, that both of you are kind of saying that, but I just wanted to be really explicit and say it's really important both for this project and for others that there is one. And so I think we should just assume and even expect and even maybe even force there to be a virtual Connect-a-thon. And so everyone should kind of have that expectation going forward.
Yeah, 100%. We'll be doing Connect-a-thons. Exactly what that means is going to be fluid. Ricky, your hand might still be up or it might be back up. Oh, unmute and check. Oh, you're self-muted. So we'll assume that it's just still up.
Yes. There was also a typed in question from John Murky about patient lists. Understand the solution, but don't understand the problem this is solving, use cases. Those were touched on in the deck. And I don't know if we can jump back. There we go. So the use cases here are provider-facing apps there. Generally, just speaking, there is this need to maintain patient lists across organizations, and how does that get transmitted, updated, all of those pieces, whether you're talking about notifications, whether you're talking, for care teams, for payers, for all those types of things, or anything around those. So I think that's kind of the general.
And I would say on this one in particular, the area that is likely to be the sweet spot is functionality that EHRs today support, but in a proprietary way. So if you look at some of the member organizations and ask, within your own API frameworks, how does an application get information about who's in the hospital right now or who's on this particular ward? Those are well supported, but not using FHIR, or at least I haven't seen any using FHIR yet. So for me, this is going to be an opportunity to standardize some of those existing practices. So we'll talk use cases, and we'll try to be driven by those use cases that are already supported in proprietary vendor software today.
All right, here, John, I can unmute. Does that answer your question satisfactorily, or?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, perfect.
Dan, have we got through the content on bulk data?
Yep. Yes. So unless there are other questions, I think that it's done.
So formally, that's all of our content for the meeting. We'll open up for any questions touching on specific projects or general practices or anything else in a moment. I should say that I know my name is listed on 3 out of these 3 projects. But in real life, this is going to be responsibility that's not just on my shoulders, but working together with Brett and Eric and Dan, and also working with my team at Microsoft that's going to be supporting some of this work with reference implementations, sample data, the sort of engineering work and community development work that should go alongside it. So even though my name seems to be attached to a lot of these, in some cases that will turn out to be a placeholder, and we'll assign better names. Gino and Carl from my team, for example, are going to be taking a really active role. So don't be too dismayed that I'm going to be spread too thin. I was helping put together these slides, and that was the best placeholder for the moment. So with that, let me pause and see if any of my panelists and organizers have thoughts to share back with the community, and then we'll open up. Okay, so we've got through our agenda. For other folks on the line, please do raise your hand if there's anything else you want to talk through.
This is Eric. I did have one point. Do we want to talk about? Do we want to talk about number 4, the possibility number 4, or are we going to push it off to another discussion?
So Mickey introduced this briefly and basically said this is going to be sort of an Argonaut steering committee discussion about whether we take on a 4th project. So I think for this kickoff call, we'll try to stay focused on the 3 that we know, but just so everyone is aware, we may wind up adding a 4th project based on our assessment of the ONC rules and everything else that's in scope. Isaac, you had your hand up. I think I unmuted you. And then next will be Keith. Keith, I'm going to unmute you as well. And if Isaac doesn't chime in, you can.
Can you be a little less opaque about the topic of the 4th project?
My goal is not to be opaque at all, but just not to share information that doesn't exist yet. So there has been discussion about how many projects we should have overall, and the answer was sort of 3 or 4. We had pretty clear consensus on 3 projects, which are the ones we've talked through. There were a few candidates for a 4th project, but none of them rose to the level of like, we definitely should take this on. So the candidates were one, doing an effort with Firecast to get more community feedback and experience working with the Firecast specification. So that would be a project that was mostly about building experience with a spec that already exists. One project was about consumer access to imaging data. I think I have that right. And the third one was particularly a technical implementation area of the OAuth spec called token introspection to give apps or services a way to understand what a given access token is good for. So I wasn't trying to be opaque. Just those were the 3 candidates we had talked through, but we haven't decided yet whether we're necessarily going to pick one or which one it is.
And part of the reason we were waiting was we were waiting for the rule to drop to see if there was some special reaction we needed to make, make sure we had space for an extra project depending on the final rule.
So next up, Keith, you have your hand up? Otherwise, next up is Rev. One sec, let me unmute you. No, Rev, I can't unmute you because you haven't entered a PIN. I don't know what that means, but you should feel free to ask your question in the chat and we'll answer it if you put it there. Anyone else with a raised hand? It looks like we're clear. So thank you all for bearing with our webinar technology. I had to reboot my computer in the middle of it to comply with some forced restart policies. So that was fun too. But I feel like we're all going to be getting better and better acquainted with the diverse web conferencing tools that are out there over the course of the next many months. So thank you for bearing with us as we go. With that, I'll say we've got a great slate of projects this year. I think they're really nicely scoped in the sense that they're going to be both important and doable. And we'll be trying out some experiments both with the technology and with some of our organizational approaches. Please give feedback. If there's something that you see that's going well, let us know. If there's something that's not going well, please let us know. If you've got ideas on what we could do differently. And with that, I think that we're ready to wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining the call.
Thanks, Josh.
Okay, thank you, Josh.